to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
So today I carry on in the series, A More Excellent Way, and it's this series on love. And Paul tells us about the gifts of the Spirit, and then he tells us to earnestly desire these incredible gifts, gifts of power and gifts of prophecy and different things. And then he says, yet let me show you a more excellent way. And the more excellent way was to use these gifts in love. And he says, if we don't use these gifts in love, they're of no value to us and that we're of no value. And I've been proposing to you that love is the greatest success principle that has ever been known to man. And that if we would use our natural gifts and our natural talents, and if we would do everything we do in love, and if we would treat one another in love, then it would have incredible results, and that it is truly the more excellent way. And of course, the four biblical types of love are storge, eros, phileo, and agape love. And agape is the greatest and the highest form of love. Because agape love is this. Agape is a selfless, sacrificial, unconditional, unrequited love. It's this love that will go to extraordinary lengths for another person. Today, the message is entitled, Love is the Answer. Now, if love is the answer, and I was Alex Trebek, what would I be looking for? I would be looking for the question. And the question, what is the question? If love is the answer, what is the question? And you know what the question is? Everything. Everything is the question. Love is the answer to everything. It doesn't matter what problem you have, what conflict you have, what situation you're in. Love is always the answer. And we look at it, what was the whole New Testament about? The whole thing is predicated on one verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He so loved the world, and everything we do needs to be that motivation of love, and that he sacrificed his love, because his life rather, that is the highest expression of love. We're willing to do it for people who are close to us. How many of you would give up your life for your child? You know, most people would be willing to do that, but would we do it for another? There was this brother and sister. He was 7 and she was 9, and the poor little girl came down with leukemia, and they did everything they had to do. And then one of the things they had to do was a stem cell transplant. And the son, the 7-year-old brother, was a perfect match. So they sat down with their 7-year-old and they explained this, and they said, you know, we need to take some of your blood so that your sister can live, and explain the whole process best they could. Remember, he's a 7-year-old. And so anyway, the day came, and they had them in the hospital, and they had beds right beside each other, and they had the IVs hooked up, and they were about to take the blood out of the boy. They take some blood. Some of you know how this works today. It's no longer bone marrow. You spin the blood, you pull the stem cells out, and inject them into the other patient, and you're reasonably painless. And so they were doing this, and the parents were trying to keep the whole thing light, and so they were kind of kibitzing and joking and trying to keep the mood light. And this little boy, as the blood started to come out of his vein, tears welled up in his eyes, and he said to his parents, "How long will it be before I start to die?" He did not understand what they had asked him to do, and he thought when he was giving up his blood for his sister so that she would live, that he was giving up his life, and he was willing to do it for his sister. And I remember when I heard that story the first time, I was so blown away by that level of love, because I think that's what we would do for someone we love. And Jesus says, if you love only those that love you, what reward is that? Because even the pagans do that. So I want to tell you an incredible story today about the past, part of our Christian history that many people don't know. And in the first 250 years of Christianity, there was 2 plagues. And archaeologists now believe, given the evidence, that they were probably both smallpox. People can get smallpox today because of the vaccine, but back then it was a very deadly disease. And so it broke out once, and that broke out again in around 249 AD. And they call it the Cyprian plague, the 250, and this one's the one that's best documented, so this is one we're going to talk about. And Cyprian actually was the bishop of Carthage. And here's a Renaissance painting of him, and it's Saint Cyprian is what he's called. And you know that he's a saint because he's got a dinner plate behind his head. And that's how they did it in the Renaissance. And the bigger the plate, the more holy he is. He's got a pizza pan behind him. So he was like really a great saint. And so here's the story. When this plague broke out, it went from 249 AD to 262. Here's the dates on it. It lasted 13 years. It was a long time. During that 13 years, 1/3 of the people in the Roman Empire died. That's how bad this was. And the epicenter of it was a city of Alexandria, which is a Mediterranean city, big port, crowded, busy port city. And 2/3, by the time it was done, 2/3 of the population of Alexandria had died, and there was times and seasons where there was 5,000 people dying every single day. Now, imagine this, if you're living in those days, everybody, Christians and non-Christians alike, that it was the end of the world. I mean, why wouldn't it be the end of the world? And so the pagans and everybody else thought it was the end of the world. During that period of time, 2 of the Roman emperors died. Both Justinian and Claudius II both died of the plague. Everybody was dropping like flies. Everybody thought it was the end of the world. And so here was the big difference. So what was happening, if people had money and power, they would run away and hide. And most of them still got it. But most people didn't have that luxury, and especially the Christians. They were a minority, and they had to stay and live in these cities, and they got the plague like everybody else. But this is what the pagans did. The pagans, when a family member would get sick, they literally threw them into the street. And every single person that got thrown out of their house, they died. And so that was the pagan response, and there was this great despondency in the land. But what happened was Cyprian wrote to the Christians, and he told them that they didn't have anything to worry about. And I'm going to sort of paraphrase what he said to them, but he said, look, you're going to die anyway, and so you might as well not get down about it, because when you do die, you're going to go to heaven, and you're going to be with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you're going to see Jesus firsthand, and you're going to be joined together with the relatives that have predeceased you. And he says, you're going to be in paradise, you're going to be in heaven. What's the downside? That's a paraphrase. I'm pretty sure he didn't say, what's the downside? But I'm telling you, in essence, what he said to him. And then he said, Jesus has commanded us as Christians that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. And so this is what the Christians did as opposed to the pagans. What they did was they went and began to nurse those amongst them that were sick, their families and their friends. And as a result, the death rate amongst the Christians was only 10%. 90% of them survived because they had food and they had water and they had care and they had love. And then, of course, they extended that not just to their own families, but Cyprian said, the Lord says to love your neighbor. And so they were actually ministering to the pagan people as well as best they could, but they were such a small number. So what happens is there's this huge devastation of population, but at the end of this, there's more Christians standing than pagans standing because of this Christian charity and Christian love. And so what happened was people saw that and recognized that, and there was a huge revival in the wake of the plague because people looked at it and said, that's the true religion. These people understand this. So their death rate is lower, and they have this Christian charity, and even the Roman emperors said, you should be acting more like the Christians, you pagans. Well, it doesn't work like that. We love one another because we were first loved by Jesus, right? And so there was this great wave of evangelism, and the church grew more during the plague than any other time in the early church. It's a crazy story because we are actually living in a time and age where we're the people of faith. We should be offering hope to the world. We shouldn't be shrinking and falling away. And I'm not saying, to be careless with your health. Maybe we need to learn some lessons from the past as how the church responded in the midst of crisis. And I want to encourage you to love your neighbor. Does that sound okay to you? All right. And Paul gave us the definition of love after he told us that he said, let me show you a more excellent way. And then he told us what the more excellent way is. And it is one tough description of love. Are you ready for this? You all know it. As 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, it says, love is long-suffering. Your Bible probably says patient, Mine says long-suffering. And I'm going to get to what that means in a moment. Love is long-suffering and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. You see, love is the answer. But I listen to this description and I say, are you kidding me? Did you see how hard that was? Do you see what you have to do? You have to endure all things, hope all things, believe all things. It's a tough thing, and that's why nobody ever preaches on it. So it's a really tough passage, and it begins by saying this, and it doesn't seem so bad in your Bible if you're NIV. Love is patient, oh, patient. My Bible says long-suffering, my New King James. Why is it telling me to be long-suffering and you only have to be patient? How many of you feel like there's a difference between those two words? I mean, sometimes you're patient, you're waiting for the doctor, and other times you're suffering long. Well, want to know which word is more accurate in the original Greek? I'll tell you. It's long-suffering. The word for patience here is the Greek word macrothumia. Macro meaning large or much, and thumia, ready for this? Sacrifice. Much sacrifice. Ooh, is that what that means? That's what that means. If we love someone or something, there is an immense sacrifice that goes with that, and you know it's true. How many of you remember this movie? Probably the older people will remember this. A movie called The Bridge Over the River Kwai. How many of you remember that movie? All the gray-haired people are putting up their hands. And it came out a long time ago, and it was actually a fictional account of a true story. And the true story was this, that during the Second World War, the Japanese were taking prisoners of war, and against international law, they were putting them to these work camps, and specifically what they were doing was they were building a railway across Burma with the intention of going from Thailand to India so that they could invade India when the time came. And they were using these prisoners of war to do this. And of course, it was a fictional account of this, and interesting story. And here's why it's fictional. There was no River Kwai. And so after the movie came out, there actually was a river that it crossed. It was the Mekong River. So the Burmese government changed the name of the Mekong River to the River Kwai so people would come and visit the bridge. How about that for stranger than fiction? Nevertheless, that was the fictional account. The true story, there actually is a true story, and it was documented in a book called Miracle on the River Kwai. And it was written by a British officer by the name of Ernest Gordon, and he was there. He was a survivor of this. And this railway they built over those 2 or 3 years while they were in the Burmese jungle, they lost, you ready for this? 80,000 people lost their lives building this railway. It was 393 persons per mile. And the Japanese didn't have any regard for the life of these POWs, and they treated them just absolutely terribly. I mean, look at this picture here. This is William Holden as his role in the movie, all tanned and well-fed, and a lot of the guys looked more like the one on the right. And these were prisoners of war. They weren't well-fed. They were living in absolute deplorable conditions. It was over 100, 110, 120 degrees every single day. The mosquitoes filled the jungles. There was disease and dysentery and malaria, and they were just literally dropping like flies in this place. You could see how poorly dressed they were. Nobody had shirts. Many of them had shorts, but a lot of them just had loincloths. They had nothing even to wear. And this is how they lived. And then as they were, this one particular group that Ernest Gordon was with, they were traveling from one location to another location, and every time they would move to a new location, they would gather up all the shovels and they would count the shovels, and they had to have, they didn't want anyone stealing a shovel. And so they got to a checkpoint and they counted the shovels, and they were 1 shovel short. And so the commandant looked to this group of men and he said, if we don't find out who stole this shovel, we're going to kill every last one of you, shoot you dead. And it was obviously very imminent. One of the men stood forward and he said, I did it. And they took one of those shovels and they beat him to death in front of the rest of those POWs. And then they carried on and they marched on to the next checkpoint, and they counted the shovels again, and guess what? They weren't a shovel short. They had miscounted. And so the man who stood forward and said, I did it, knew that every man in his group was going to die, and he sacrificed his life so that they might live. And all of a sudden, everybody knew that. For no greater love does a man have than to lay down his life for his friends. And that became the turning point in this story, is that when that man gave up his life for people that he didn't hardly know and didn't even really like, all of a sudden it did something with the rest of the group, and they started to pull together, and they started to support one another and help one another and feed one another when they were sick and care for one another. The mortality rate dropped dramatically as a result of this, and they even ministered to and cared for their Japanese captors because they were getting sick too in the jungle. And then Ernest Gordon, who wrote this book, The Miracle on the River Kwai, he became the unofficial chaplain of this group. And they survived this ordeal because of this thing called love and caring for one another. Back in the 80s, some of you remember what was happening in New York City back in the 80s. There was a real AIDS crisis, and people were, in the AIDS community, were dropping like flies because of AIDS and this disease. And there was one particular church, and the community that it was in had become more of a gay-friendly community, and his congregation had dropped, and he was down to about 20 people. And he thought to himself, what am I going to do? How am I going to survive in this? Nobody's coming to church. And I've got this tremendous crisis all around me where people are dropping to this terrible disease. And he came up with an idea, and he didn't know if it would work, but he just decided to try it. And he got placards, and he put them up on telephone poles in various locations around the community saying, free funerals for AIDS victims. And then one day he got his first call, and this man said, my partner has passed away. Are you telling me you'll do a free funeral for my partner? He says, yes, I will. And so anyway, he did the funeral for this man that had passed away of AIDS, and for the first time in several years, his church was full, and with the gay community that lives around his building. And he did this funeral, and people were happy, and it was successful. And then a few weeks later, he did another one, and a few weeks later, he did another one. Every Sunday, he had his 15 or 20 people there, but every couple of weeks, he was doing another one of these funerals with the local community, the people who actually lived there coming into his building. And then they began to come to him and ask him for counsel and ask him for prayer and ask him for spiritual help. And he began to minister to these people. And every Sunday he noticed that his congregation was growing and growing. And guess who was coming to church now? The people from that very gay community that he was ministering around. And it was only a matter of time before his church was full. Why? Because he learned this very simple principle of loving your neighbor. And it's sort of interesting to me because we look into Scripture, and this is who we're told to love. We're told to love our spouses. We're told to love our children. We're told to love our families. We're told to love one another. We're told to love our brothers, which are our brothers and sisters in Christ. We're told to love our neighbors, and we're told to love our enemy. Who's left? There's not very many people left. This is what we've been asked to do. And it was G.K. Chesterton who said this. He said, the Bible tells us to love our enemy and to love our neighbor, generally because they're the same people. and I thought about that, and I thought that's sort of true. So I want to tell you a personal story here. And this was years ago. We bought our first house, and we moved in, and our kids were growing up in this home. And our neighbor, who became a great friend of mine, he moved out. He had retired, and he was moving to the country. And so you're sitting there thinking, who's your next, your new neighbor going to be? And our houses were literally right together. We actually shared the driveway. The two driveways are right together like this. And I'll never forget that Saturday morning when our new neighbor arrived. And in rolled the pickup trucks, and in rolled the motorcycles. And this biker dude moved in next door. And there's all these Harleys and these pickup trucks and all this furniture. And you do know what the difference between a Hoover and a Harley is, don't you? One has the dirt bag on the inside, the other one has the dirt bag on the outside. That's a biker joke. And bikers will forgive me because they have to love me. That's how it works. And so anyway, this guy shows up with his friends, and I got real suspicious when the furniture started going into the garage and not into the house. And the couch went in there, and the TV went in there, and the fridge went in there, and I went, oh no, this dude's gonna live in his garage, which is right beside my front door. And sure enough, that's what he did. And by the end of the day, when he and his buddies had moved everything in, they were having a party in his garage. And there they were drinking beer, and AC/DC music was playing, and marijuana smoke was drifting across the yard into my yard. And anyway, I thought, I hate this guy. And he had only been in a day, and I already hated him. You're all looking at me. You hated your neighbor? You're a bad pastor. And so anyway, this is what the guy does. He decides he's going to plant a garden. And because he owns a home now, he digs up his whole backyard, digs up all the grass, and then he planted seeds in it, I guess, and it was a big mess of sod all upside down. And then he turned the sprinkler on. Are you ready for this? And he went away for the weekend. And the sprinkler was running like this all weekend long. And a Saturday afternoon, I'm in the backyard and I'm looking, and his whole backyard has become a lake. The whole thing is just soaked, and the water is creeping up to his window well in his basement. And I thought, you know what I want to do? This is what I wanted to do. I thought I should get a lemonade and a chair and sit here and watch this moron's basement get flooded. That's what I was thinking. But I am the nicest guy you will ever meet. Have I ever told you that before? I am the nicest guy you will ever meet. And so in an act of extraordinary neighborly love, I went and turned off that tap. I know, it wasn't much, but it was a start, right? It was a start. And so then here's what happened, not a word of a lie. He never touched his backyard or his garden again. The whole garden, by the middle of the summer, was 6-foot ragweeds. He never mowed his grass. And the reason he didn't mow his grass, because he didn't have a lawnmower. Guess what I did in my second extraordinary neighborly love act? Yeah, I went and mowed his grass. I mean, it was a selfish act. I didn't want his dandelions blowing into mine, I'll be honest with you. So every week I went and mowed his grass. I thought, big deal, I'll mow his grass. I don't care. I never asked him, never told him I was doing it. And one day he comes out, he was home. One day he comes out while I'm mowing it, and he says, what are you doing? I said, I'm mowing your stupid grass. What does it look like I'm doing? And he says, I was wondering how it was getting mowed. I said, what did you think? Did you think it was mowing itself? And he didn't know how it was getting mowed. I said, did you think it was mowing? He says, do you think I should get a lawnmower? I said, what do you think? I was trying to be nice, but it was hard not to be a jerk because I sort of am one. And I said, what do you think? So then he went out and bought a lawnmower. And you know what? That little moment actually kind of turned us into friends. And I thought, you know what? I didn't really like him, but I'm sort of starting to warm up to this guy. And he actually wasn't a bad guy. We ended up being pretty good friends. And you know what? All he needed was a little adult supervision. That's all he needed. And I was just the guy for the job. And we ended up, I remember when we moved out of there, how, we said goodbye and we hugged. And it was funny how just a little, I sort of despised him when he first moved in. But by the time I left, we had developed this great love. There's a story I love by a guy named Alvin Vandergrind, and here's what he did. He decided that he was going to pray for 5 neighbors, 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 5 weeks and just see what would happen. So he picked 5 specific neighbors and he started praying for them, and this is what happened in those 5 weeks. First of all, the local drug dealer that he was praying for came and asked him to pray for him that the Lord would help him get off drugs. And then the Buddhist couple across the street, they came to church with him. The Hispanic couple on the other side of the lane, they joined their small group Bible study. And then a woman a couple of doors down, a single mom, she gave her life to Christ. That all happened in 5 weeks. All because he did this simple act of praying for people, loving them, instead of despising them, hating them, or ignoring them. Let me remind you what Jesus told us. He said, this is in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you to love your enemy, do good to those who hate you, to pray for those who persecute you, and basically tells us that we are to love the people around us, including our neighbor. And you know what? Christianity is the only religion in all of the world that actually commands us to love our neighbor. Jesus commanded us to love our enemy, love our neighbor, and like I said, sometimes those people are the same people. Your enemy is not some terrorist on the other side of the world. Do you know who your enemy usually is in our day and in our culture? It's the person that lives in the apartment across the hall. It's the person who lives in the house across the lane. It's the person who has the desk across the aisle at the workplace. And worse yet, it's the person who sits across the dinner table from you. And it's more often than not, it's the people who are closest to us that end up becoming our enemies, or some of those people. And I'm not going to ask you, but if I was going to ask you who is the enemy in your life, who is the person you struggle with the most, I can guarantee you it's not somebody on the other side of the world. A number of years ago, I was in this situation where I worked with this woman, and she was in the place of authority, and she had a strong personality, but was profoundly insecure on the other hand. Now, I always think that that's a terrible combination for a leader to be insecure. And I'll tell you why. When insecurity is, it's a problem in our culture, and I have compassion, minister to people that are insecure. But when it's a leader, when it's somebody that's in authority that's insecure, those people become dangerous people. And I'll tell you why. Because they become manipulative, and they become controlling, and they don't do things for the greater good, and they're always doing things that will make them look good or feel good or for their own reputation, and the motive always becomes wrong. So here I'm in this situation where the person in authority is someone with insecurity. And then I was so glad when life moved me on and I went somewhere else, and I thought I never have to deal with that again. Now, I was not bitter about it. I'm a forgiving person. You know my motto, to forgive everybody all the time. But I was grateful to be out of that situation and done with it. 10 years later, I'm now pastoring a church. I've got a little bit of notoriety in the city. I was invited to be on a committee at a major citywide event, and they wanted me to be part of this. And I said, sure, I can be part of that committee. I showed up at the first committee meeting, and guess who the chairperson was? Notice I didn't say chairman. It was the chairperson, and it was her. And I went, oh my. Oh no, I can't believe I'm in this situation again. And I remember going home that night and telling Kathy, I said, I'm thinking of bailing on this. And the whole time while I'm telling her I'm bailing on this, I'm talking myself out of it, because I felt like that the Lord was setting me up. And I felt like, and I don't have a hotline to heaven, but I do have a wife that talks in my ear, and it's usually about the same thing. And I remember having this conversation with her and thinking, God's setting me up, and he wants me to serve this woman and make her look good. There has to be times where you're willing to follow, and you're willing to follow in a good attitude. And I thought, I can do that. And I can serve her, and I can make her look good, and I can use my organizational talents to try to help her make this a successful event, which it was, by the way. And I was pretty proud of myself, because I thought, I'm there. I got there. I managed to get through this whole thing until the very last night. Because on the last night in the event, she came up with this idea that she wanted us to give gifts to the organizing committee. And I pushed back on this, and I said, that's not really the point. Why would we give gifts to ourselves? Anyway, I lost out on it, so I submitted to it, and I said, fine, we can do that. If you want to do that, we can do that. And then the other shoe dropped. Are you ready for this? She asked me to make the presentation of the gifts on the last night. And I thought, why is she asking me? I don't even want to do this at all. Then it dawned on me, she wanted me to be giving her the gift. And congratulate, I thought, she wants me to stand up there as the last presentation was her. And she wanted me to be giving her the presentation and telling this crowd of people what an amazing job. I thought, I've been set up here. I said, Lord, you set me up. And I felt like the Lord said, remember, I don't have a hotline, but I felt he said, yes, I did. I thought, I can, in integrity and honesty, I can tell him what a good job she did. So anyway, at the end, I made this presentation. I told everybody what a good job she did. I gave her the flowers that she bought for herself. I gave her the flowers, and she stood up and smiled, and like she was all surprised. And I thought, this is bizarre. Why am I doing this? Because the Bible says to love your enemies. And it was the funniest thing. After I did that, I realized I still had this little wedge of resentment in my heart towards her. Even though I had forgiven her, I realized there was something there. And in that moment of publicly praising her and loving my enemy and giving her what she wanted, by doing that, it absolutely just melted all of that away. And I thought, this woman that I didn't really like before, that's all disappeared. And I can actually say, I love this woman. and I have no bitterness or untowardness in my heart. And see, that's the power of love. Because love bears all things, endures all things, believes all things, hopes all things. Love never fails. Why? Because love is the answer. Let's stand together, shall we?